In this tutorial, I will demonstrate how to use Premiere Elements to create a famous documentary trick called the Ken Burns effect. We'll learn who Ken Burns really is, why he's an icon in the videography industry, and how we can use his motion simulation effect to create more engaging productions. So this is Ken Burns, kind of a nerdy looking guy, but he's an extremely famous documentary filmmaker. The 4 films you see below there, Civil War, Baseball, Jazz, and The War, were films that won awards, Emmy Awards in particular. He was also nominated for several Academy Awards. Never won an Academy Award, but obviously it's prestigious just to be nominated. Anyway, Ken Burns is most famous for introducing, or actually he wasn't really the first person to use this technique, but he popularized the technique of giving motion to static images, taking photos and making them seem like they move by panning or zooming. And let me show you a simple example here. In this documentary film about Abraham Lincoln, taken from the History Channel's YouTube channel, you'll see a few archival video clips, but most of the content in this introductory sequence are photos. And there'll be a slow pan or a slow zoom effect applied to most of these photos. So let's just watch a few seconds of this, and I think you'll see what I mean.
April 1865. A country barely recovering from death on an unimaginable scale is now plunged into a new type of mourning. Just as the guns were falling silent on 4 years of civil war, the man who had held the country together through that war has been felled in his hour of triumph by an assassin's bullet. During his 4 years in the White House, the United States had been changed forever. Despite being torn by secession and civil war, it was a single country.
Now, what I want you to notice here as we watch this is how several things are happening. We have a series of photos with a few video clips, but these photos have a slow zoom or slow pan effect applied to them, and occasionally there's some dissolves here. Personally, I find these dissolves very, very distracting, at least the ones that are sustained for a long time. But all of these photos have the same thing in common, and that is that each one has either a slow pan or a slow zoom or a slow tilt effect applied. And I want to show you how to do that. Okay, so here I am in Premiere Elements, and I've got a photo, a stock photo that I found online, royalty-free, and I've placed it in my project bin here, and now I'm going to drag it simply into the timeline, into the Video 1 track, and I've stretched out the zoom a little bit on my timeline here so you can see that the default insert duration is 5 seconds. Now obviously I can change that, and that's going to depend to a large extent on the amount of narration that I have and how much other footage I have. And so that's going to be context dependent. But before we add the pan and zoom effects here, I want you to make sure that you understand that you need to estimate as best you can the actual duration of the photo that you need in advance. So for example, if you had to stretch this out to, let's say, a 10-12 second interval, go ahead and do that before you apply the effect, because it does create a few problems if you try to stretch out the duration after you've already added the effect. So your first step, of course, is just determine how long you need this photo on the screen. The second step is to go ahead and activate the effect, which is under the Tools menu. Well, I tell you what, let's get rid of the Projects tab here and move that back up. Under the Tools menu, there is a Pan and Zoom option. If you select that, it loads up with 2 default frames, one green and one blue, and you'll note that one is number 1 and the other is number 2. What this allows us to do is to take this photo and start with our initial frame. In other words, the beginning of the motion effect. And in my head, as I'm planning this, I'm thinking I want a wide shot, wide close-up shot, and then I want to zoom to an extreme close-up. So my number 1 frame I'm going to put right here, and notice that you can resize them as you need to. Try to resize the corners so you save the aspect ratio of your project. By default, the frames will have the same aspect ratio of whatever your project is, and in our case it's 16:9. So I'm going to zoom in right about there and position it right there. So you have a nice close-up shot here, and we're going to move to an extreme close-up. So I'm going to come down here and grab frame number 2, and I'm going to put it right there, and I'm going to zoom in even tighter. I want to get his eyes to his beard, something like that. Now that looks pretty good. Here's the problem. If I mouse over this frame, you'll see that there's a default hold for 1 second. If I mouse over and activate this frame and then mouse over, there's a default hold of 1 second. What that means is the motion effect doesn't take place until after a second has expired. And I find it hard to understand why they have this set up as a default option here. And let me play it for you. There's a preview play option down here. I'll play it, and you can see that we now have this nice zoom effect, slowly zooming in. But when we get to the end, watch what's going to happen right here. It's going to pause for a second. Boom, and then it locks up. That's a convention that not many filmmakers tend to use anymore, so I would recommend that you get rid of that. It's very easy to get rid of that hold if you simply exit the preview up here on the right hand side and go back to each frame. You can click on the hold 1 second and then drag that handle there so that the duration is set to 0, and then do it for each frame. So hold, I'm mousing over it, I click, there's my duration, and I'll drag it to the left to make it 0. And now when I play this for the preview effect, there is no hold. It's this nice, smooth, consistent zoom in effect. And I could have very easily just made this a panning effect if I'd moved everything around, but I'm not going to. I'm going to click done here so I can show you what it looks like now in the main preview window. Notice that my default duration here hasn't changed. I had stretched it out to 10 seconds, and that's where I kept it. But when I press play now, you can see that we get this beautiful, nice, smooth zoom in effect here. And again, you're going to have to experiment with the timing of this based on the amount of narration that you're going to need. I would highly recommend that you avoid fast zooms and fast pans. This technique is most effective when the zooms are very, very subtle, even more subtle than this. This is a pretty aggressive zoom compared to some of them. So I would put this zoom that I've just demonstrated here at probably the fastest you would want to have a zoom effect applied in your particular project. So to review real quickly, go to after you've put the image in, go to your Tools tab, select Pan and Zoom, and then position these rectangles where you need them and resize them. If I wanted to focus on start of his jacket, maybe have a panning effect here. Excuse me, not a panning effect, but a tilting effect. Which is kind of unusual in portrait shots. We don't usually start with a torso shot here and then pan up, but I simply want to show you how this would produce something similar. We have this profile tilt up shot here simply by moving those selection rectangles around. And I'll click exit preview there to go back here. And I hope you find that this is really easy to use and it's incredibly effective. Just make sure that you stretch out your durations. Make them long enough so that the effect is slow and subtle. You do not want to try to make this aggressive. That will blow up most graphics hardware on intermediate class machines. One other recommendation I'll make is to make sure that you choose images that are already very high resolution. In other words, they're very large. You can always come up to the slider here and drag it around to make this image much bigger. And Premiere Elements will blow it up to make it larger. Typically, when you find images on the web, sometimes they're pretty small, and if you blow them up, they start to look really grainy, which is what we see here. So do your homework and really try to find footage that is of very high quality to begin with. But just know that you can use this convenient slider right here to resize the frame. You can also do this from within the actual preview window. If you double click on that and move the frame around, you can even get selection handles here that allow you to resize. But I think it's much easier if you stick with the Tools menu down here, Pan and Zoom, and then use this resize slider up here. So that concludes this brief tutorial on the Ken Burns effect. Have fun integrating this technique into your homework assignments, and I look forward to seeing you next time.